I have an incredibly exciting interview for you today. I recently had the pleasure of interviewing Kat Winters, who has written 5 books for young adults, as well as been included in the short fiction anthology Slasher Girls and Monster Boys. Kat is a critically acclaimed and award-winning author, and I'm so excited to have her on the channel. We discuss in this interview how to use all of the different senses to create really creepy horror atmosphere. We talk about pacing, and we talk about always keeping your characters moving forward in order to keep your readers turning the pages. So if you're interested in learning how to write creepy horror and also creepy thrilling fiction, watch until the end of this interview because we had a fantastic, fantastic conversation. So without further ado, let's welcome Kat Winters. So thank you so much for joining me today. I'm so honored and thrilled to have you on the channel. Could you start by telling us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Well, and thank you for having me on here. I'm excited to be here. I'm Kat Winters. I'm based in the Portland, Oregon area of the United States. I write haunting historical tales is how I often describe them. My YA novels are In the Shadow of Blackbirds, The Cure for Dreaming, The Steep and Thorny Way, Odd and True, and The Raven's Tale. I have 2 novels for adults that I've had published. Those are The Uninvited and Yesternight. And I was a contributor to the YA horror anthology Slasher Girls and Monster Boys.
I read that. That's a very cool anthology.
Oh, good. Glad you enjoyed it. Yeah, it's a few years old at this point, but it's still going strong. It's still out there and showing up in bookstores.
Yeah. So, what is your favorite thing about horror or spooky, creepy historical tales, and what initially drew you to that kind of writing?
I think it just kind of goes back to a childhood love of ghost stories. I developed a love of Halloween and ghost stories at a really young age. Halloween was a really big deal in my elementary school. We had a huge Halloween carnival every year, and we got to dress up for school on Halloween and at the carnival. We had teachers playing really creepy music. I don't know if you're familiar with the folk tale, The Ghost of John, but that was something vividly remember singing when I was like 6 years old in first grade. It was singing about a ghost who didn't have any skin on his bones.
That was very dark for
the last line is wouldn't it be chilly with no skin on? So
Oh.
that's how my childhood started. And I grew up in a really modern area. That the town I lived in was new when I was living there. It was in Southern California, built on old ranching land. And so all the buildings were new. There was really no tangible history. There was certainly history of native tribes living in the region. But for like anything that you could just see, everything just looked really modern and new. So I think I was drawn to stories set in the past and kind of ghostly stories just because it was a little bit different from what I was actually living on a day-to-day basis.
Right.
And just because it was just so available to me. There was in my elementary school library, I stumbled upon a book about real haunted sites and was introduced to the idea that people did actually believe that some places were haunted. It wasn't just in books and movies that some people were convinced that they were living in haunted houses, and that just freaked me out. I was probably too young to be reading that information too. I was probably like 7 or 8 at the time. I'd have nightmares about ghosts from then on, and I was convinced my room was haunted. But for some reason, I still kept reading ghost stories and watching scary movies and starting to write scary movies. I actually have a copy of a short story I wrote in 2nd grade about a haunted house. So one of my first short stories was about a haunted house. So it's just something I've been doing for as long as I can remember, and still just kind of get a thrill out of being scared. I love watching, especially during the month of October. I love watching as many scary movies as I can, even when it freaks me out when I'm going to bed and the house is quiet and I'm convinced that something's on the other side of the door.
I know, I'm the same way. I love watching them, but they always freak me out, and then I regret it, but I just keep going back. It's a weird
Yeah, I don't know. It's a
fascination.
strange. I was watching something scary. I was watching Crimson Peak last night, which I hadn't ever seen, the movie from I think 2015 or so.
Mhm.
And I was going upstairs. Everyone else had gone to bed in the house. I was going up by myself, and I was thinking, I wonder if there's like psychological studies about people who like horror and who people like me who do this to themselves, where they just keep reading ghost stories and watching scary movies and writing scary stories. And it's kind of like, why am I doing this to myself? Why do I like this? Why, or the psychology of loving Halloween? I'd just be curious. I haven't, I could easily Google. I'm sure there are articles out there about that, but it's
Yeah, I'll
not something
Google it
I've ever
after
explored.
our conversation. I'm super
Yeah.
curious about that too. Like I'll watch a scary movie and I'll go up the stairs, like shining the flashlight over my shoulder, like looking over, make sure nothing's following me. I think
Right.
also as writers, like we have imaginations that can fill in the blanks in really graphic, creepy ways, which makes like being
Yes.
in the house at night very scary.
Right. Right. Exactly.
I mean, you mentioned that you started writing stories when you were really young. Have you always wanted to be an author?
I I feel like I was always an author. I didn't necessarily think of it as a thing I wanted to be
Mhm.
until probably after I graduated from college. I just always wrote. That's just what I did. I was a theater kid too, and I
Oh,
really
so was
wanted to be. Oh
I.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's pretty common for writers too. I
Mhm.
really wanted to be an actress. That was my thing. I went into college first as a drama major, and then I added English as a double major.
Mhm.
Um, but that was my first love. I was convinced I was going to do the theater. I had family members who would say, "Are you sure you want to give up writing? Don't or don't you know? I know we know you love the theater, but are you sure you don't want to do this for a living instead?" And granted, both acting and writing are really challenging professions to both get into. So it's not like writing would be my easy fallback day job. So it's kind of funny thinking back on that. But so it wasn't a huge surprise to people when suddenly in my early 20s I said, okay, I'm going to take writing seriously. I'm going to look for an agent, and I researched how to become published at that point. So
Mhm.
it just seemed like a natural flow of the course of my life.
Yeah. What did your writing education look like? Like, were there resources that were particularly helpful to you as you were learning how to write?
It was kind of a hodgepodge writing education. Like I said, I majored in English in college, but I went the literature route.
Mhm.
Back then, I didn't want anyone telling me how to write. I didn't want. I had taken a creative writing class in high school and loved
Mhm.
that. I had teachers starting back in second grade who had weekly writing assignments, and I feel like that early writing just really did was extremely
Mhm.
helpful for me. It just taught me about writing every week,
Right.
about constantly writing, about getting where how to draw inspiration from the world around you or from prompts. So that was really helpful, just getting that early encouragement too, and just early feedback that there was something exciting about my writing.
Mhm.
So in college, like I said, I didn't want to do the writing side of an English degree, but I felt like what I did was really helpful for becoming a historical novelist because I studied literature, learned how literature is so tied into history,
Mhm.
and reading literature from any era is basically kind of studying the history of that era. And even if the writer's not writing about the era, they are. And anyway, even if they're writing fantasy or if they're writing historical
Right.
fiction about some past era, they're really reflecting what's going on in their own world. And that's something I really drew from my studies of literature in college, and just realized that was something I wanted to carry with me
Mhm.
when I started taking writing seriously. And then I took some courses after college and started going to some writing conferences, and I felt like everything I learned along the way just really helped kind of fill in everything I needed and gave me a really strong toolbox of different techniques and just ideas for how to approach writing.
Right. Yeah, you mentioned earlier that one of the things that drew you to historical fiction was growing up in a space that was really modern and being curious about what it was like before. Do you think that there are any other things that draw you towards writing historical books that are creepy instead of setting the books in the more modern time?
Well, I think it also goes back to an early fascination with classic Gothic literature. That was definitely a big influence. I was reading the Bronte sisters.
Oh
I
yeah.
got into Edgar Allan Poe pretty young, and my most recent novel, The Raven's Tale, is about Edgar Allan Poe as a teenager. And he was assigned to me as my author to study in my American literature class in high school. So I got
Oh
to
wow.
start getting into Poe and really exposed to all the various stories and poems that he wrote at a young age. I was a big fan of Daphne du Maurier.
Mhm.
Her novel Rebecca was a favorite during high school. The very first novel I ever completed was something I wrote in high school that was just basically kind of a Rebecca fan fiction. It was not using the characters, but it was very heavily inspired by the setting and the characters in that the, the classic Gothic English novel.
Yeah, I love the Bronte sisters. They were my favorite in college. And like I had this book about them that I think if I'm remembering correctly, like they grew up right next to a cemetery or something. So they grew up playing like in the cemetery or something. It was like, I don't know. I might be wrong about that. I just remember that really
I haven't
sticking
read
in my
actually
head.
too much about them, but that would be cool. I know there's books about them, so they were fascinating.
Yeah. What does
Yeah.
your research process look like for your books?
Well, usually a book starts after I've like found something, especially with my historicals, found something in history that really just kind of how I describe it is the piece of history grabs me by the shoulder and just
Mhm.
begs me to write a book about it. And a
Mhm.
lot of times there's already other historical ideas that have been planted in my head, and it's just kind of like the culmination of like all these various little seeds of history. And then when I find like the big piece that's really calling to me, then all the other little pieces fall into place. So um, it starts. A lot of the books have started by when I'm researching one of my other books, I go down like a little rabbit hole of research and come across something else really fascinating, and that's when those big
Right.
ideas jump out at me. And then just the research is just a constant process. I
Yeah.
write. I'll research before I sit down to write. The while I'm in the process of writing, I'm researching. I do often stop and research to figure things out, and that can certainly interrupt the flow of writing. But it's just such a huge part of historical fiction. I'm very particular about getting everything as accurate as humanly possible. So it goes to the very last stages, the very last proofreading stages of a book. I'm still researching, and even before I talk about my book in public, I'll go back and double check all my facts. And my debut novel was about the 1918 Spanish influenza pandemic.
Mhm.
And just nowadays, when I'm tweeting about our current pandemic, I'll like double check my 1918 pandemic facts that I go back to some of my early sources just before I even tweet something saying, "Oh, this is something I learned back then about this pandemic." So
Right.
I feel like it's just a constant learning process.
Yeah, I had a professor, my English professor or fiction writing professor in college, always used to tell us like that was his one. He was like, you can write anything you want and you can write historical fiction, but it is the hardest genre to write. And I wouldn't advise it right at the beginning.
Oh,
So he
I,
scared
I,
everybody in our class.
oh, I started from the beginning with that, so I just took the challenging road from the get go.
You're braver than anybody else in my class.
Well, I also never had anyone tell me not to write it, so that might have made me pause and think about what I was doing a little bit more.
Yeah, well, I don't know if it was necessarily the best idea on the professor's part either, but I don't
Yeah.
know. But so when you're researching a piece, is there any like, where do you find out all of this information? Do you use Google searches? Do you go to the library? Do you read a lot of books? Because I think a lot of people might be daunted about doing the research and how to even start doing research for something as intricate as a historical fiction. I can't talk. As a historical fiction book.
Uh, I mean, a lot of it starts with Google. And granted, when I first started writing, this was years ago before the internet. That was really challenging. Where I like
Oh,
looking back, I may be thinking, how did I do that? How did I find? It was a lot of going to books and libraries, going to
yeah.
bookstores and libraries. But just thinking about that just blows my mind that that's how we used to research. And I did go into the libraries and talk to librarians who would take me to newspaper old newspaper files on the microfiche. So that there were ways to do it before the internet, but now that the internet has been here for years, I certainly a lot of times just start with Google searches, and I really love finding still looking for newspaper articles
Mm.
about the time periods. Like my novel Odd and True, it was based on there was a monster sighting in 1909 America. And if you look through all the newspaper articles in the areas of Pennsylvania and New Jersey from that time period, from that week in 1909, you'll find tons of articles about this monster sighting. So I
Wow.
did lots of searching through the newspaper archives and found as many articles as I could, so I could figure out my descriptions of the monster and what was going on back then. Um, Advertisements from an era will just really help with what your characters are eating and how they're dressing. Diaries are really helpful for my novel In the Shadow of Blackbirds. There were a lot of letters from a World War I soldier, and so I found a lot of World War I letters just to find out the language people use and what they talked about, what they were allowed to talk about in their letters home. So
Oh,
just
that's fantastic.
yeah, just anything I can find. And there's still a lot of I'll just sit down and read a lot of books too, and just to get as much info as possible. But starting with Google searches is certainly an easy way to get the ball rolling, just to find out where your other resources are out there.
Yeah, I imagine voice is really hard. Like you have to read a lot of letters and really practice in that voice in order to get it down. Because voice is just such an elusive thing. Like you can't really deliberately, like you have to just do it so much that it becomes intrinsic almost. Like you
Right.
can't intentionally go down and try to change it. At
Yeah.
least in my experience, yeah. But horror as a genre is defined by so many tropes. It's like a very trope heavy genre. When you're writing historical horror pieces, do you rely on any tropes, or do you like incorporating horror tropes into your work, or do you disregard tropes, or do you like inverting tropes? How do you interact with the tropes in the horror genre?
Well, yeah, certainly I'm very aware of the tropes. I've had a few kind of the haunted house
Mhm.
tropes involved in some of my books. And just like rules about ghosts, like each book is a little different. Each of my own books are a little different, where I have to kind of think about the rules. What are you typically the rules for what ghosts can do and who can see
Yeah.
them, and
Mhm.
are they transparent? And
Yeah.
so that's kind of like that's my main focus, is just to kind of looking, since I use a lot of legends and folklore and paranormal creatures. I'll think about, what's typically done, what do the legends say about these characters,
Mhm.
how can I use that for my story. um, but I that's an important part of building your paranormal world, is just to make sure you have the rules straight and figure out what you're doing with every with the guidelines that you've been given from horror writers of the past. And um, I've never the horror that I do is, it's not really the girl goes into a place and you're yelling, "Don't go in there! Don't go in there!"
Right.
You might get stabbed, sort of horror.
Yeah.
But there are still, but even that being said, there are some elements of that. And like in Odd and True, there's a little bit of that, where there's a character going to a place where you're saying, "Don't go in there, don't, you shouldn't be going in there."
Mhm.
But it's so that it's fun to play with
Definitely.
definite with traditions of horror like that.
When you're writing horror books and like compared to watching a horror movie, you have to rely on language so much to be able to instill that feeling of like fear and unsettling feeling within the reader. Do you have any tips for making your writing scary and like creating that unsettling feeling in the reader when you can't rely on things like jump scares?
What I usually recommend, it's something I do on my own, and when I teach writing workshops, is I really emphasize the use of sensory language in
Mhm.
writing horror. I mean, it's good for any genre, but horror is such a sensory genre.
Yeah.
um, I tell people to really think about the whole scene and every single one of the senses in that scene, and that just is a really easy way to put your reader into your setting there and have them experience the characters are experiencing. And I'll even start with something like as basic as a haunted house story. When you go into the house, you not only want to talk about what you're seeing and hearing, but what are they feeling? What are they touching? You know, are there cobwebs? What are they smelling? Certainly old scary houses have distinctive smells about them. What are those smells?
Right.
What is that smell coming from? There could even be some taste involved. But just, I
Right.
feel like that's just such a, when I'm reading a good horror story, I feel like I'm just in there and I'm living it. And that's a big part of it. I think if you look at any book that really pulls you in, if you go through and look carefully at what the author's done, you'll probably see a lot of that sensory language in there. So you're fully aware of the atmosphere that you're in.
Do you ever find, how do you balance including enough detail to make the atmosphere really suffocating, but not adding too much detail that it slows the book down?
Well, I think I can't remember who gave me the advice, but one time I received the advice to always keep your character um, moving through a scene. So if you're talking about what they're smelling going into this haunted house, have them going and investigating the smells. So not just standing there, I smell this.
Yeah.
Just have it be a part, or if they're like an exercise I do a lot of times is I have a character, I tell my students to have your character going into a house and looking for something. So they've got a goal, they've got a motivation, but they're still experiencing this creepy surrounding.
Yeah.
And so just have it as part of their experience of doing what they're setting out to do.
Do you have a book of yours that scares you the most?
I would say I'll go back again to In the Shadow of Blackbirds. That one I think is the most, I had the most nightmares from writing about it. There's some really scary birdman characters in it that you aren't quite sure what they are. But I would say that was the one that I was probably the most scared while writing it. I would scare myself doing research at nighttime for the book. And to this day, I would probably say it's probably the one that is the most unsettling. Especially sometimes I think about what I had my characters going through, and especially their teenage characters. I sometimes step back and go, "Oh my gosh, what did you do to those poor kids?" That's one thing you really can't do as an author of YA horror is really step back and say, "Oh my gosh, what are you putting them through?"
I know it's like with YA characters generally, like you have people who are far older being like, "Oh, that's my baby."
Yeah.
Oh, he's the one I'm in love with. Oh, it's like he's 16.
Yeah.
So do you outline your books or are you more of a discovery writer?
I do a little bit of both. I saw, I wish I could remember who it was, but somebody online, and I would love to give them full credit by saying this. So I'm sorry I don't have that in front of me, but she described herself as being a puzzler, I think is how she put it, where it's a little bit of both. You're kind of seeing how the pieces fall together. I usually kind of outline in my head at first, especially the first several chapters. I know how I want my books to open. And then I usually just let myself just sit and write without writing down an outline. But then I reach a certain point where I start thinking, oh, things are getting complicated here. I'm starting to lose track of what day it is, how many days have passed. And so what I do then is I print out a calendar, and I just did this actually yesterday for a book, a calendar that for the month that my character is in, and kind of do a little day planner type of way of outlining their days so I can keep track of the passage of time. And then I start kind of plotting ahead to saying, okay, this needs to happen. Here's where the book is going to end at this point on the calendar. So what do I need to do to get there? And how am I
really smart.
doing too much before I get there, or am I not doing enough? That's my own little way of plotting.
What does your editing process look like? Like how many drafts do you usually do? How much time goes by between like draft one and the final draft?
I am an author who tends to do a lot of revising as I go along, which can make for a much slower process, but I feel like it really helps me because I'll think of things that are important that need to be established in the beginning of the book, when I'm in the middle of the book. So I go back and I figure out how can I make that work. And there'll be days where I just like read the book from the beginning to the point where I'm at, just to make sure it's all flowing and working cohesively. So I feel like by the time I finish my first draft, it's not horribly messy. I know that's not the advice that people are given a lot of times. Everyone says just get the draft done, get the words on paper, and then you can clean it up later. But that's just not how my brain likes to work. And there's times where I try to fight it and just keep going, but then I realize, okay, if this is working for me, then just, certainly there are times where I can speed myself up and say, don't worry about that. We can fix that later. But I've learned to not be so hard on myself for revising as I go along, because I just feel like that's just part of my process. And then when especially after I sell a book, then there's multiple editing stages with my editor. And a lot of times before I sell a book, I will give it to critique partners and do some revisions at that stage. Before I even submit it to anyone else. And then there's all the various revision stages once you actually sell a book.
No, I mean, really you have to figure out what works for you. It's like everybody's individual process is so different that there's no one right way to edit and write a book. It's like it depends who you are as a writer. And also it's better to stop and edit what you've already written if you were going to write something that is going to counteract something or an idea that you had and change the ending. Like if you know that the ending of the book isn't going to ultimately be the real ending of the book, there's no reason to continue writing something that you've already decided against.
Exactly. And I think that's important. Those are important things for newer writers to hear, that there's not one set way to do this. And writers get so much advice thrown at them that sometimes you have to figure out just what works for you as a writer.
So when you're outlining your books, do you have a favorite plot structure that you like to follow, or are there certain specific beats that are particular to horror that you like to always include in your books?
I'm just always very aware of the idea of mounting tension throughout the whole book. And usually I know how my books are going to end, but I don't necessarily know all the details about it. So I remember learning early on about just kind of thinking of your book as like rising and falling and rising a little higher and falling, just setbacks and constant conflicts. So until you get to your the big climax of the book. So I've always kind of just mentally thought about that in my head, about just the rising and falling action of my scenes, and just throwing obstacles at my character, and the obstacles just getting more and more intense. I remember my agent early on telling me she would always give me the notes to up the stakes in my book, and just up the stakes. And so in my head, I sometimes hear her voice saying up the stakes. So just making sure the stakes are high enough is something that I definitely am aware of. And I do like the concept of a ticking clock, where we've got a deadline. This is the characters need to accomplish this by a certain time, or this will happen to them. So that's one of the big plotting devices I do like to use, is just think, what is our time frame here? What do they need to do by this time, or else everything's going to fall apart.
Do you have a favorite point of view that you like to write in?
Most of my novels have been first person. In fact, all of my published novels have been first person. I'm currently working on a third person project right now, and I'm having fun with it because it feels like a fun break. I just kind of the first person just felt right for the stories in the past, and for the current one, it feels right to do third person. I usually do first person past. The Raven's Tale was first person present. That's my only present tense book. So that was interesting to play with that for a bit.
Yeah, I also like first person because it keeps everything really like grounded in exactly what's happening right now. Like when I was trying to write, and I tried writing a project in third person past, and I always found myself as like the narrative voice trying to interject stuff and doing a little bit too much telling. So as soon as I brought it back to first person present, it just like was right there with the characters the whole time.
Yes, it's a lot more immediate, definitely.
Yeah. So what is your best piece of advice for somebody who wants to be a young adult author?
I would say definitely read as many books as you can, just kind of get a feel for the age group and what's out there. But then again, you do not have to follow anything that you're reading. When I first started, because I started writing adult fiction and just had a really hard time selling my adult works. And then when YA was becoming popular, I decided to change and try writing young adult fiction, because one of my book ideas it seemed like it wanted to be told from a teenage point of view. And I thought, okay, maybe I'll try this. So I was agented at the time, but I had not sold a book at the time. And my agent gave me a bunch of books to read for certain things. Like I remember this was when The Hunger Games was still newer.
Oh,
I think
yeah.
only 2 books of the trilogy were out, and she said, read this for world building. So I did that. And then I read a bunch of other books for the love triangles. At the time, love triangles were big.
Mhm.
So I made the mistake of trying to put a love triangle into my debut novel, In the Shadow of Blackbirds, and it wasn't working. It got in the way. So I ended up deleting the love triangles. So I say the advice of read in as many books as possible, with the caveat that you don't have to follow everything in it, but just to kind of get an idea. I felt reading dystopian YA actually really helped me with my debut novel, because it was a very dystopian feeling historical period.
Mhm.
So even though it was a ghost story, I used some dystopian tropes and influences to create my historical world.
Right.
So that was a benefit of reading other YA, is just you realize, and that was something I also discovered, is how much I could play around with genre
Mhm.
for writing in the young adult age group, which was something that I could not do in adult fiction. Everything had to be one genre, or else the publishers were very confused by it, and
Mhm.
their salespeople didn't know where to place it or how to market it. But
Mhm.
so yeah, so read as much as possible, but also just go with your gut instinct. And I would say one of the biggest things is just write for your teenage self. Write the
Mhm.
books that you wanted and needed as a teen. That would, yeah. So I say read the books, take what you can, and then just keep that in mind, that there's this inner teen in you. If some writers are teen YA authors. If you're past the teen years yourself as a writer, definitely, I feel there's probably stories that all of us wish we would have had and could have had when we were
Definitely.
coming of age.
Well, my last question is, in your opinion, what do you think the secret is to scaring your readers in your writing, if you had to pick one thing?
I would say picking subjects that scare yourself, going back to yourself as your first audience member. Again, I can't remember who said this. I wish I had all my sources to cite, but somebody once said, write what scares you, that write about the things that you find scary, and that'll come across to your reader, because it'll be an authentic response when you're writing about it. And it
Right.
could be anything from spiders to abandonment, whatever makes yourself anxious. That's your own personal fears are going to come across to the reader, and just make it all the more realistic for your reader.
Mhm.
So that's a really, I found that a really helpful piece of advice.
Well, thank you so much for joining me today. I feel like I've learned so much just from listening to you. Can you
Oh, good.
tell everybody who is watching where to find you online?
Sure. My website is catwinters.com. That's cat with a C, and the Winters. I am on Twitter at Cat Winters. I am on Instagram as Cat Winters Books. You can, but all my social media links are on my website, so that's the best place to go as a starting point. And you can find links to all the other places where I haunt, all my other
Perfect.
haunts.
And I've put all of the links to your social media and the website in the description of this video.
Oh, thank
Again,
you.